Hi everyone! This month's terrifying trio celebrates a staple of the horror genre, the haunted house. Content warning. The following movies and book contain graphic, bloody violence, as well as suggested or threatened violence against women and children. Viewer and reader discretion is advised. Our first movie this time is the 1959 classic House on Haunted Hill. Directed by William Castle, a director known for his entertaining horror gimmicks in the 1950s, this film featured a skeleton that was supposed to menace moviegoers, and perhaps if a skeleton suddenly descended from the ceiling of a theater you were sitting in, you would be duly menaced. Starring Vincent Price, this film tells the story of a rich man who has invited 5 strangers to spend the night in a supposedly haunted house that he and his wife have rented for a party. If you stay the night, you'll receive $10,000, or if you don't survive, your next of kin will get the money. And of course, everyone is soon trapped until dawn. While horror movies are often criticized for stock characters, the assembled players here are an entertaining bunch, and it probably helps that they're archetypes from a different era. You have a test pilot named Lance, a young office worker named Nora, who is the only member of her family able to work after a tragic accident, Dr. David Trent, a psychologist studying hysteria, a newspaper columnist named Ruth, who claims she wants to write about ghosts, but who also has a gambling addiction she needs to pay for, and Watson Pritchard, the man who actually owns the titular house. He claims that he needs the money, but after his brother was murdered in the house by his wife, he vowed never to set foot there again. Vincent Price plays Frederick Lauren, and it's really a treat to watch him chew the scenery with his wife, Annabelle. She's his 4th wife, and all her predecessors have died under mysterious circumstances. Now she's determined to outlive him and inherit everything. The two chuckle about the time she tried to poison him and how he's never been able to prove she's been unfaithful. This is the kind of toxic movie marriage that's just a delight to watch. It's kind of sad that they despise each other so, because in a world as big as ours, it's kind of beautiful that these two sadistic maniacs found each other. But of course, not everyone is going to survive a night in the house on Haunted Hill. From the start, Nora is the target of most of the supernatural activity. Ruth is marked by what looks to be blood dripping from the ceiling, but it never does anything but drip. First, Nora is almost crushed by a falling chandelier. While exploring the basement, she's menaced by one of the caretakers, a blind woman who appears to glide as if on roller skates. And Lance is attacked by an unseen force in an otherwise empty room. Later, before everyone is locked in for the night by the caretakers, which everyone knew was coming, except they leave early, much to Nora's chagrin, Mr. Lauren, who insists throughout the night that the party was Annabelle's idea, distributes party favors to the guests, a handgun for each person. Lance advises Nora to take hers. She doesn't want the gun, but by now, she's fairly certain that Mr. Lauren wants to murder her. Annabelle has spoken privately to Lance by this time, and she's also sure that her husband plans to kill her. Nora, hoping to show the other guests that something supernatural is really going on, tells everyone to come upstairs and see the severed head she found in her suitcase. But of course, by the time everyone comes to look, the head is gone. Dr. Trent believes that Nora is becoming hysterical, and soon after, the body of Annabelle Lauren is discovered hanging from a noose above the stairwell. We never see her face, only her feet dangling from her nightgown. The group sans Nora meets to discuss what is clearly a murder. No one believes Annabelle could have committed suicide in such a way. But while the other party guests believe that Frederick Lauren is the killer, he believes that someone else is seeking to frame him. In House on Haunted Hill, the oddly well-lit basement is practically a character itself. One of the previous owners of the house converted it into a wine cellar, and Watson explains, while giving the guests a tour, that the man's wife didn't think his wine was any good. So he filled a vat with acid and threw her in. Nora almost falls in, and Lance catches her. By the way, if you think this guy is the hero of the picture, he's not really. I mean, this is a movie where if you're looking for a hero, I guess this guy kind of fits the bill, but mainly everyone who manages not to die is just kind of doing their best and hoping to get lucky here. To prove the vat is still filled with acid, a dead mouse in a trap is pushed into the liquid, where it quickly dissolves. Movies don't actually come with big signs that say plot point, but this one might as well. Nora, alone in her room later on, after all the guests have retired for the night, and agreed that if anyone leaves their room, they're all but admitting to murder, sees Annabelle floating outside her window, and the end of the rope around her neck actually coils itself around Nora's ankles, before slipping back out the window. It's never explained how this feat is accomplished, but it really doesn't matter, because a movie like this is about cool visuals, the occasional jump scare, and of course, a murder plot. It turns out that Annabelle is having an affair with Dr. Trent. Together they manage to fake her death with the help of a hanging harness, terrorize Nora, and basically drive her to the point that when she flees in terror to the basement in the third act and finds Mr. Lauren, she shoots him. After she runs screaming from the room, Dr. Trent emerges from his hiding place to dispose of Lauren's corpse. The screen goes black as we hear a brief struggle, then a splash. Presumably someone has gone into the vat of acid. The denouement of this movie is perhaps one of the most delightful and ridiculous in the history of cinema. Annabelle hurries down to the basement in her nightgown, looking for her lover. Instead of finding David, the door creaks shut, the candles grow dim, but you can still see fine, and so can she, don't worry. And a skeletal hand touches Annabelle's shoulder. She screams and backs away as the skeleton seems to walk toward her, speaking in her dead husband's voice. The skeleton taunts Annabelle, who screams and backs away, and eventually falls into the vat of acid after a slight push from the skeleton. It's at this point that Vincent Price emerges from the shadows of another room in the basement. The skeleton is revealed to be a kind of marionette that he's been controlling, which he throws into the acid vat with the remains of Annabelle and Trent, who he pushed in before. The guests, led by Nora, hurry into the basement, surprised to find Frederick Lauren alive. He then reveals that she didn't really shoot him. He loaded her gun with blanks. He'd suspected that this house party was an elaborate ruse planned by Annabelle and Trent as a way to murder him, and Lauren claims that after their plan failed, the two lovers fell into the acid vat. This movie is a wonderfully weird celebration of classic horror tropes, and if you watch it with Riff Tracks Live, it's even more incredibly fun. Vincent Price is at his most charming and diabolical, and whether you watch it in color or black and white, there's enough here, a charming cast, some decent scares, but not too much gore, to satisfy both horror fans and your average movie buff. I rate this film a skeleton marionette and a vat of acid as murder weapons because that's all you need to know. Our second film is The Haunting, a loose retelling of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. The house on Haunted Hill, weirdly, is not in any way related to that novel, in spite of the very similar titles. Eleanor, Nell Vance, played by Lily Taylor, has spent the last 11 years caring for her mother, and following her mother's death, her sister and brother-in-law inherit the apartment they shared and plan to sell it. Nell happens to have insomnia, and she is invited to join an insomnia study organized by Dr. David Marrow, played by Liam Neeson. Also, this movie came out the same year as Phantom Menace did. Being at loose ends and not knowing what to do next, Nell goes to the Massachusetts mansion where the study will commence. Two other subjects, Luke, Owen Wilson, and Theodora, Theo, Catherine Zeta-Jones, join Nell and Dr. Marrow, along with the doctor's research assistants and the house's caretakers. Unbeknownst to Nell, Luke, and Theo, Dr. Marrow, like Dr. Trent before him, is actually studying the psychological effects of fear. What better place to do it than in a supposedly haunted house? Dr. Marrow tells the group that Hill House was built in the 1800s for the wealthy Hugh Crane. He and his wife Renee hoped to have a large family, but all of their children were stillborn, and following Renee's suicide, Crane withdrew into the house. Following what seems to be an unfortunate accident, the research assistants leave and supernatural occurrences begin, though for much of the movie, Nell is the primary target of these events, and the three other people in the house are unconvinced that she's really seeing ghostly children. They think it's insomnia, or perhaps a bigger psychological problem. After the words, "Welcome home, Eleanor," are written in blood on a painting of Hugh Crane, Theo and Luke are convinced that Nell is behind the strange things that keep happening, as is Dr. Marrow, who finally reveals that he brought them to Hill House to study fear. But after a statue tries to drown the doctor, the group finally sees that Nell isn't responsible. By this time, Nell has discovered that Hugh Crane became rich in part due to the child labor he used in his factories. Some children were even tortured inside Hill House, and following their deaths, their bodies were burned in the fireplace, thus explaining the ghosts that Nell's been seeing. As it happens, Crane had a second wife named Carolyn, and Nell turns out to be a descendant of the couple. After this reveal and the near death by statue, Dr. Marrow tries to get the group out of the house, only to be confronted by the ghost of Crane, who won't allow anyone to leave. Luke gets understandably angry at this development and damages a portrait of Crane. He is then decapitated by the giant fireplace. Nell is determined to free the spirits of the children who died at Hill House, so while Theo and Dr. Marrow attempt to evade the ghost, maybe not a great plan in a house controlled by his spirit, Nell tells the ghost that she is not afraid of him. Fear, it seems, is the ghost's source of power, and though he is trapped in a bronze door depicting an unsettling tableau, where children are also trapped, Crane attempts to imprison Nell too. Fortunately, the children she sought to help are able to free Nell in return. She dies after the confrontation with Crane, but with their spirits freed, the children's souls, along with Nell's soul, ascended to heaven, while presumably Crane will enjoy an afterlife of the fire and brimstone variety. Dr. Marrow and Theo are finally able to leave the house, and they do so without speaking to the caretakers as they pass them at the gate. I guess finding Owen Wilson's corpse is meant to be a fun surprise! Also, it's been a while since I've seen this movie, but I seem to remember Nell floating and sort of dissolving after the ghost fight, so I don't think she left a corpse. Like so many horror films before and since, The Haunting was a critically panned commercial success. It's not a good movie, and it's not so bad it's good, but it is a movie that exists. And as someone who saw both The Island and Master of Disguise in theaters, my mom bought the tickets, but I know I'm culpable. I can confidently say that there are worse ways to spend 2 hours of your life. Master of Disguise is only 80 minutes long, but it doesn't feel like it. I recall seeing it only because, unlike the house I grew up in, the theater was air-conditioned. Not a ringing endorsement, I know, but if you want to see a movie where Owen Wilson gets decapitated by a fireplace, then this is that movie. Our book this time is Nothing But Blackened Teeth, a novella by Cassandra Caw. The focus of the story here is Kat, who withdrew from college to address her struggles with depression, and now she's been invited to the destination wedding of 2 high school classmates, Faiz and Talia. Faiz is a good friend, but Talia resents Kat for encouraging them to break up at a time when their relationship seemed to be toxic for both parties. Philip, heir to a wealthy New England family, has paid for everyone to come to Japan, where he's rented a Heian-era mansion for the night. Lynn, the last person to arrive, brings food and drink in great quantities, and the 5 friends commence their celebration. Perhaps friends is putting things a bit strongly. Though the group were close in high school when they loved exploring supposedly haunted locations together, this night reveals how time and trauma can strain relationships. Right away, Kat knows there's something strange about the house. For being abandoned, there's too much inside. Tatami mats that look fresh, creepy dolls and ancient books that have become the homes of insect larvae. And it doesn't help that whoever Philip rented the house from wanted to keep the whole arrangement hush-hush. Kat keeps hearing a voice whisper a line from a poem, Sui no Matsuyama Nami mo Koinamu, which roughly translates to, if I were to love someone who was not you, the sea waves would rise and sweep over Sui no Matsuyama. And she sees the face of what looks to be an Ohaguro Batari reflected in an old mirror. This is a yokai, a creature of Japanese mythology that's dressed in a bridal kimono. She has no eyes or nose, just a red mouth filled with, you guessed it, nothing but blackened teeth. Why doesn't Kat tell the others about what she hears and sees, you might ask? Because the bride-to-be is quick to anger, regardless of what Kat says, and Faiz is eager to appease his soon-to-be wife. Philip, who Kat has cautioned to not reveal that he and Talia briefly dated, is going to perform the wedding. He got ordained online. And Lynn is just there for Kat, though the 2 friends have been distant ever since he got married without telling her. He argues that, deeply depressed as she was at the time, she wouldn't have wanted to know. Plus, this is a group that's been drinking and exploring the house for several hours while telling scary stories. So when Kat initially brings her concerns to the group, they're dismissed as something she's only saying because she's drunk. So even though this is a group of people who are familiar with horror tropes, none of them have ever actually experienced anything supernatural. They love the idea of haunted places, but the reality doesn't seem like an actual threat until it's much too late. As the evening progresses, everyone is a little drunk, and as they explore the house while telling ghost stories, Talia, having declared that she always wanted to get married in a haunted house, is about to get her wish. But what's the story behind this particular mansion? Philip explains. Hundreds of years ago, there was a bride who was waiting for her groom to arrive for their wedding. But he was killed on his way to the mansion. So the bride asked to be buried alive, so her spirit could wait for his to return. And every year after, a new girl was buried to keep the first bride company. There's no telling how many bones rest in the dirt, or how many women were smothered in the cool earth over the years. Or maybe it's all just a story, told to make the place seem like a more interesting rental opportunity. By the time the wedding is going to commence, Kat and Lynn want to leave. They've seen just enough strange and unsettling things in this ruined mansion. Doors appearing in walls without warning, paintings of yokai that seem to move and even come to life. And Lynn's reasoning is that since Kat is queer and they're both Chinese, if something out of a horror movie is about to happen, they'll be the first to die. Philip, blonde and all-American, will be safe, as will the married couple, presumably. Instead, when Faiz goes to lift Talia's veil, he finds that she has been replaced by the Ohaguro Batari. The yokai smiles and laughs, but will say nothing about Talia's whereabouts. And in a house with a history of human sacrifice, it seems clear that not everyone will survive the night. Rather, if Talia is to be saved, a book Faiz finds indicates that a ritual needs to be completed, with different bodily fluids distributed at each cardinal direction. But who will die in place of Talia? And how? This novella received a lot of positive blurbs from authors, but based on reviews, many readers seemed to love the idea and cover, but were disappointed by the execution here. For my part, I'm accustomed to horror stories that spend more time setting up the tale than they do in the denouement. It seems almost unavoidable. If the thing stalking the characters in a horror story lingers too long, it can lose its bite. Here, the Ohaguro Batari quietly menaces the group for just a handful of pages, as do other yokai, like the Hyakume, a creature with 100 eyes. And though Kat and Lynn have time to share a joint before the brutal death in the final chapter, they don't ever grow accustomed to the paintings of yokai come to life, or the eyeballs peeking through gaps in the walls, doors, and windows. Near the end of the novella, Kat reflects on the fact that even when you know you shouldn't do something, in both real life and in horror, it can be very hard to resist the momentum that seizes you. And it can be so hard, perhaps even impossible, to stop something like this, once it's begun. Sure, I was left wanting more scares, but this novella is quick, brutal, and made for an entertaining afternoon's reading, or listening. I enjoyed the audiobook. Ultimately, I think there's something to be said for the idea that places aren't really haunted. We are. What you bring into a house, including knowledge of its terrible history, informs your experiences there. It also bears mentioning that all of these stories focus on women, because traditionally, women's experiences have either been silenced or minimized, and the gaslighting of real suffering people can lead to more horrors being perpetrated in places that eventually come to be haunted, not because of ghosts, but of the very real tragedies that happened there. Of course, in real life, you probably don't have to worry about ghosts. But in fiction, who knows what ghastly ghouls and evil entities you'll find in the next haunted house you visit. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again soon for another terrifying trio.